So does this series of numbers mean anything to anyone? For a few unlucky people, it probably brings back a memory of pain. Something like that, a speeding ticket. And the reason is because there's an upper bound limit and a lower bound limit. And while most numbers like that represent statutes that govern the law of limits, such as speed and velocity, most of them deal with the upper limit. You're going too fast and you get pulled over by a police officer, and then you get charged. But there's also the minimum limit, and there's something very intriguing about that. So this particular statute deals with the fact that you can actually get ticketed for driving too slow. Now, I know it doesn't happen very often, especially not in this state, but if you think about it, just like rules and laws, there are always exceptions, and then there are exceptions to exceptions. So similarly with limits, there are limits or limitations to the limits, and then further limits to those limits as well. Such as, in this case, the exception is if you're going at a slower speed or velocity because it's necessary in order to operate safer or in order to comply with some other fact. So as you think about this, you start wondering about, okay, in the space of cars, what would happen if there were no limits? Perhaps things would get more unsafe and more people would die. So it's necessary as a lower bound limit. And then think about space shuttles and rocket ships. So they have this notion of escape velocity, but it's only possible because of two limits: drag coefficient and gravity. Because without those two limits, there would be no way to escape at all. And then you see a sign like this, and then you start thinking, how in the world do I navigate the limit of that half mile? Always start thinking about, okay, the limits of limits, and then it starts getting pretty absurd. So this phenomena of limits is something that I'm genuinely curious and intrigued about. As a college professor, I get to experiment and research the phenomena of limitless and limits, and because of experiential learning, we get to incorporate the concept into the courses, because let's face it, as an educator, our number one objective is to unleash the potential of the next generation, which basically involves limitless and then understanding limits. Hi, my name is Mukesh Patel, so please join me on this journey, this brief journey, to explore this a little bit deeper. Let's look at the context of incentives and rewards. So this is a theoretical limit of the glass ceiling, which many people struggle in their lives to get close to, and then eventually break through and achieve some sort of velocity beyond that. But it also exists in the form of salary caps and limits that professional sports leagues and franchises can offer on an annual basis. So here are the curves for the four most prominent sports leagues in the US, ranging from hockey to basketball to baseball and football. And as you can see, those limits are quite high, ranging from tens of millions to hundreds of millions in terms of capacity to compensate and incentivize and reward professional athletes. But then let's look at the lower limit. The lower limit is the federal minimum wage for employees throughout the country, currently standing at $7.25 per hour. How do you reconcile these extreme limits on both sides? Well, look at this curve. The growth of CEO to the average worker compensation ratio was relatively flat for many years and then starts growing exponentially, which starts achieving close to escape velocity from that perspective. And other than the two dips that are caused by the collapse of the markets in 2000 and 2008, it's starting to continue that exponential growth. Then, how does the US fare with this ratio of CEO to average worker compensation across developed nations? As you can see, the US is achieving escape velocity at an average ratio of approximately 354 times. So then we look at the median monthly hourly wage in, let's say, 10 US companies amongst the top 10 companies. And what does that look like for the average worker? Well, it looks something like this. It's approximately $8 and change in the blue box, which is relatively close to ground zero, because when you compare that to the CEO hourly wage or compensation, it's close to $8,000 an hour. That's a CEO pay multiple of over 874 times. Again, escape velocity. But then Limitless is not democratized. There are unintended and adverse consequences to society that we must also be thoughtful about. And so if you think about income inequality, there's also wealth inequality. For example, in the United States, the top 1% of the population basically owns and controls approximately 20% of the wealth. The bottom 90% of the population owns and controls 20% of the wealth. 1% equals 90%. The top 10% owns and controls approximately 60% of the wealth. So you start seeing how this limitless and limits start impacting social consequences. The phenomena of limits is also applied to the laws. So here we have the US Constitution, the construct that basically governs the United States of America and its democracy. It's got very limited articles, and yet it's so powerful and adaptable that even with changes, exceptions to the rule, we have the Bill of Rights, which contains only 10 amendments. Again, very limited constraints or exceptions that still are flexible and govern lots of humanity. But let's look at the First Amendment. There's something called the freedom of speech. But it's not limitless. In fact, it has very rational and reasonable limits attached to it. For example, there is a time, place, and manner constraint or boundaries attached to the freedom of expression, so that you can't just say whatever you want in private settings, or you can't incorporate obscenity or incite violence, for example, or state lies. These are all limits to the limitation of manner. Then there's mindsets, the potential for human capacity. So if you look at the spectrum of mindsets, on one side of the limit, you have the static mindset, which incorporates things like you're gifted or you're smart. On the other side of the spectrum, you have the extreme opposite of that limit, called the growth mindset, where it's basically about agile learning. Can you learn, unlearn, and relearn really fast? And if you can do that and show a little bit of persistence and grit, perhaps there are no limits to what you can accomplish or achieve. This is Wilfredo Pareto. I'm not sure if everyone in the world is familiar with him, but everyone is familiar with his concept called the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule. Essentially, the 80-20 rule works like this. It's a phenomena that more things in life are not directly proportional in terms of output versus input. So the concept here is that because you have unequal distribution amongst these inputs and outputs, here are some examples. 20% of inputs create approximately 80% of output. Now, it doesn't mean that 20 plus 80 has to equal 100. You can actually have something like the 80-30 rule or the 90-20 rule, and they all are valid. The concept is just that, for example, 20% of employees produce 80% of the results. 20% of customers create 80% of the revenue, and so on and so on. You can apply it to your personal lives. We all probably wear 20% of our clothes 80% of the time. And this is the curve, mathematically speaking. So most people fall on the red curve, the straight line, linear thinking, where input equals output. But theoretically, if you apply the Pareto principle and you focus your effort on limited things and you put all your effort on those few limits, you can actually achieve escape velocity. And then if you apply it to itself one more time and compound it through exponential powers, so the 20% times 20% equals 4% of input, 80% times 80%, 64% of output, you start getting into even the next level of exponential powers. There is this notion called the expert generalist. So if you apply the horizontal line, it's breadth of knowledge and learning. And so you should learn unlimited things and learn as much as you can without limits and build your peripheral vision so that you can connect the dots innovatively and creatively. However, at the same time, you should limit most of your effort to 1, 2, or maximum maybe 3 disciplines and go really deep to become experts in that space. And together, if balanced well between the limitless exponential breadth and limits and the power of limits, you can actually go further. Have you been asked the question, are you an introvert or an extrovert? Those are binary limits. They're artificial. Because between those limits exists an unlimited spectrum of possibilities. And as human beings, we are neither introverts nor neither extroverts and shouldn't label ourselves nor allow anybody else to do that. And we should really consider that we are all ambiverts, but strategically thinking about where on that spectrum we ought to be given the circumstance or how we need to respond. What about the limits of color? With just 3 colors, red, green, and blue, you can theoretically approach more than 16 million colors digitally. And in the physical world, which is 4 colors, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, you can start achieving escape velocity at 2 to the power of 32, which is approximately 4.3 billion colors, with just limited inputs. And how about lifespan? Can you imagine if we didn't have a finite lifespan? What would we always think when we get up in the morning? Well, basically, you would put off till tomorrow what you can do today. Forget tomorrow, how about in 100 years, 1,000 years? I'll get to that in 10,000 years because you have no sense of urgency. There is no limit, and therefore, perhaps nobody does anything. And then you start thinking about the world's population. It took us several 100,000 years to get to our first billion population. Our second billion population only took approximately 133 years. In a third billion, approximately 33 years. Fourth billion, 13. And then today, we're approaching that theoretical limit of approximately every 12 years, adding another billion people onto this population. So you start thinking about theoretical limits, but yet the human minds collectively, 7 billion or 10 billion, we're going to get there soon, is quite remarkable. Then we have the paradox of choice. That is a very interesting phenomena because these choices and options that we live in today, of the world that we live in today, create decision fatigue, paralysis by analysis, anxiety, and buyer's remorse. You buy this, and afterwards you say, I should have bought that. No matter what you buy or how much you buy, you always have this fear of missing out. What did I miss out on? So what's similar about these 3 particular brands? If you think about it, they're all very successful companies: Apple, Costco, and Aldi. Aldi also owns Trader Joe's. These companies succeed because they offer relatively limited choices compared to lots of their competition. There's a study done by Columbia University in Menlo Park, California, that basically looked at 2 groups for a study, and they had 24 choices of jams, we can call it ice cream or whatever dessert you like, versus 6 samples on one side. And they observed where people would navigate and what would they be attracted to. So it turns out 60% of the people stopped by the 24 samples because there were more choices, and only 40% went to the fewer choices of 6 samples. But the outcome is quite opposite, and it's quite telling. Only 2 customers were generated given more choices, and 12 customers were generated with less choices. So perhaps it's not as intuitive as we initially think. Mathematically, you get a function or a curve that looks like this, and the top limit, as the variable x approaches limitless or infinity, the outcome actually becomes smaller and smaller, and theoretically approaches 0. Never gets there, because it's not about the perfection, it's about the pursuit of perfection, as Lexus would say. The second limit is the opposite. As you get smaller and smaller in the x domain, the output becomes limitless, theoretically. So it's been empirically proven that less is more. And if you think about limits in a different perspective, think about limits in your life, and perhaps they are artificially created. So if you artificially create limits intentionally, you can probably get to more creative decisions. And a consulting firm, McKinsey, actually did a study on sparking creativity in teams. It's an executive's guide, where they found that artificially constraining your business model and the options you have and putting limits will actually achieve theoretical, close to limitless in your output. So hot cannot exist without cold. Neither can light without dark, black without white, rich without poor, strong without weak, success without failure. And similarly, if we want to think about limitless, perhaps it doesn't exist without limits. So the concept is, instead of thinking just limitless, flip it. Perhaps it's less limits. And so with fewer limits, but acknowledging them, discovering them, and then embracing them, ultimately mastering them. And once you master them, you then get to do something very interesting. Because all limits, perhaps, are artificial, arbitrary, and capricious. And the biggest limit of all is ourselves, our own mindset. We are the biggest limit as to what we can achieve and accomplish. So therefore, once you start mastering it, and then you can actually test and push these limits beyond belief. And when you do that, you can achieve breakthroughs and potentially, hopefully theoretically, achieve escape velocity. So go ahead, test and push your limits to the extreme.